All right, guys, for our final segment of Asian responses to the new imperialism, we're going to take a look at China. But just before we do, I wanted to review quickly the trend that is occurring in this time period, where again, the Western world has taken dramatic advantage of the Industrial Revolution, the superiority in regards to government and bureaucracy. That comes out of the Enlightenment. And as a result of that, and also much better finances is going to allow them to take over the rest of the globe. And not only that, but to influence and weaken some of the other empires around the world. And as others like the Mughals, the Ottomans, attempt as best as they can to try to reconstruct their economy in the Western mode, they find themselves in debt to the Western world. Many are upset, particularly the conservatives are going to try to stop as much as they can the changes that are going on in society. And in that effort, in doing so, they are going to cause enough turmoil such that groups are pitted against one another, and there is subsequently some form of dramatic change, usually some kind of revolution that ends these long-standing empires that we've studied so far. Okay? So today, again, the topic here is China, and it is the last of the five topics that we have looked at in this particular lecture. Okay? But before we get there, first, a few things to note in regards to China. Okay? The last Chinese dynasty, as it turns out, wasn't Chinese at all. In fact, the group known as the Qing, or known as Manchus, who actually invaded at China at just the right time as the Ming dynasty was collapsing all around, was able to seize power in their support of that last monarch and the eventual betrayal of that last monarch, and it was able to seize and create what is known as the Qing dynasty. And one of the telling marks of the Qing is what they had ethnic Chinese men do. The sexiest haircut in world history. Yeah, no, maybe. Hey, maybe you try this. Maybe at some point it'll come back into popularity. But either way, this itself became a sign of subservience, this haircut right here, where if you're an ethnic Chinese man, this is a reminder that you are of a lower class and a lower standing than your Qing Manchu conquerors. And that's going to lead eventually to the decline of the Qing as, again, a minority group that has taken over a majority Han Chinese um, country. Now, there are also other issues that China has always dealt with. Now, some of this stuff seems counterintuitive in that there were really good things that occurred, changes in the 17th, 18th centuries that look like it was going to be beneficial, particularly if you look at this graph right here, the dramatic increase in population that is brought about by the Columbian Exchange, new crops, new goods that were brought in, corn and um, potatoes and others that will actually help for the increase of the Chinese population. More marginal lands and properties are farmed, and the population actually increased. But the problem is, it reached again. There's that Malthusian um, curve issue where it reached a crisis point where even with all those marginal lands and properties, they were not able to feed them, and as a result, you had major food shortages and crisis, economic destruction due to overfarming, and not only that, but a number of internal rebellions as well, particularly anti-Manchu rebellions. The most famous of which is the White Lotus Rebellion, which actually was a attempt to try to um, overthrow the Qing because people were frustrated with overzealous bureaucrats who were taxing too much, many who harassed farmers in lieu of taxation. The response to some famine conditions, crowded conditions in the cities, and many of them actually there's a religious undertone in that this would be sort of one of those millennialist uh, um, uh, religions whereby there's this belief that Buddha himself would come back and bring about an end to suffering if they succeeded. But either way, the White Lotus Rebellion failed. But even this relatively small scale uprising required 5 times the annual revenue in order to suppress. In other words, it took quite a bit of effort for the Qing dynasty to suppress this relatively small uprising, a sign of things to come. Okay? But all the while, the attitudes of the old Chinese system remained. And we see this with the British bureaucrat coming to visit the Emperor Qianlong, the McCartney mission, and not only failure, but then also a revealing of the growth of Britain and the decline of China. So you're going to go ahead and pause the video at this point and go ahead and evaluate based on the reading in the Google Doc that is provided and also some of the background. So read this document and go ahead and summarize and source this document as such. So go ahead and pause the video right now. Hopefully, you've looked at the document and used the clue in terms of particularly the sourcing and looking at the occasions. Look at the background from the textbook and be able to say, look, hey, it's one thing for Qianlong to have such a haughty attitude. The realities, however, are changing. And so again, you can source this document by looking at the context and again the overall big picture decline of China, not necessarily that it's getting worse, but relatively to the growth of the West and Britain and so forth. Now, a key turning point happens not with Qianlong as monarch, but we go halfway across the ocean, and that's with the long reign of Queen Victoria, who's famous for a number of things. But is she famous for being a drug dealer? Sort of, not really. But there is a drug problem, particularly what we call a called opium, which is a hallucinogen, which really it's bad stuff. It really knocks people out. It really makes them um, unserviceable members of society. Now, it's a poppy based drug that has been used in China for centuries prior to the 19th century. But what the British find is that the British find a market for opium. And what they start to do is to grow this stuff in India. And what they'll do is they will smuggle this into China because why? They had their own drug problem, and that would be with tea, as it turns out. Okay? For years and years, and why Qian Long wanted to come in, or excuse me, why McCartney wanted to come in and tell Qian Long, hey, open up some ports. You need to take some of our, uh, take a look at the products that we have to offer. Is because Britain was running quite a bit of a trade deficit. In other words, it needed Chinese silks, porcelains, and particularly Chinese teas. Okay? And the only thing the Chinese were accepting happened to be silver, again, the currency of the world in the 16th, 17th centuries, and so forth. Okay? And so Britain found the solution to this. Okay? Smuggling opium, okay? Come out with silver, take that silver, okay? And go in officially into Canton or Guangzhou, the official trading port, and actually now be able to buy the tea and other goods necessary. Okay? But what it did was it started to rack the Chinese countryside in southern China, leading to Chinese officials regulating much of the opium trade. In other words, they're going to arrest local merchants. They're going to start to harass British smugglers and others who would be involved in this trade. A number of Chinese restrictions, some overzealous bureaucrats that were really aggressive against the British, led to war. There was enough on both sides to say, look, this is enough. This is, you have dishonored us enough. Let's go to war. And maybe a century ago it would have been different. But by the 19th century, it is the British Navy, which are they're still using sailing ships with some steam powered in them. But again, British cannons are going to overwhelm the small Chinese Navy and the weak army without advanced firearms, leading to one of the first unfair treaties that would be placed upon China. This is the Treaty of Nanjing, which gave the British a number of items. The first of which is a hunk of rock by Guangzhou, right by Canton, that will be leased to the British, which will eventually become Hong Kong. Hello, motherland, and it will become one of the financial capitals of the world. Not only that, but what Lord McCartney was aiming to try to do in the first place was to open up other ports of trade. Again, right here is Canton or Guangzhou. Hey, this was the only place where the British could trade with China. All of a sudden now you are going to open a number of others in Hangzhou, in Shanghai, and others as well. So opening up of other trade cities. Hey, and not only that, But British citizens will gather for themselves this right of extraterritoriality, which we've discussed previously before. Okay? But not only that, but you have now the ability for missionaries to access the interior of China for the first time. Okay? Now, there are going to be some successful missions organizations in bringing Christianity to China, but it is a really different culture that the British are bringing in, not just their own culture, but then also the Christian culture as well. And oftentimes, if you've ever played the game of telephone, you whisper something in one person's ear, they whisper something back, and so forth and so on. Eventually, that message gets warped. And one unintended consequence, again, this isn't the fault of the missionaries by any means or the aims of the missionaries, but one unintended consequence of this game of telephone happens to be the Taiping Rebellion. Starting in 1850, and it really begins with a man by the name of Hong Xiuquan, who's actually a failed civil service candidate. So, in other words, he's somebody who took the civil service exam, hoped to become a scholar gentry, and failed. Right? And in doing so, he went through a crisis, heard from his uncle about a message of God, of Jesus. But by the time it reached Hong Xiuquan, it was slightly different. Enough for Hong to believe somehow that he was the Son of God himself, Jesus' younger brother, right, who was sent to China to reform China. And what he formed was a group called the God Worshipper Society, the Taiping Tianguo, or the Kingdom of Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, or just simply the Taipings. Okay? And so, what they believed in with this new message is the sharing of common property, which many poor peasants hoped that they could actually have a better life with. Women's rights were supported, anti Confucianism, the elimination of prostitution, slavery, foot binding, all these oppressive measures that have existed under the Qing, cleaning up of opium smoking, and so forth. And this became a really popular message. And all throughout central China, there is this massive uprising that the Qing government, if you look at these dates here, have an enormously difficult time suppressing. About almost a decade and a half of war. There's a seizure of traditional capital, wars fighting back and forth, resulting in, and we talk about everything being bigger in China, about 20 to 30 million deaths that would occur as a result of this. The failure or the long-term failure of the Taiping Rebellion was also a failure of the Qing government in dealing with this particular issue. And so this was finally the point. And as we talk about these breaking points where there was this need to modernize. And so what starts off in what we call the self-strengthening movement of trying to reform and to recreate the Chinese military and industry in the Western standard, it begins right here as a result of the Taiping Rebellion. Okay? And so we have, again, a bureaucrat in this case, Feng Guofan, who is going to make a push for this. And he writes a document called The Adaptation of Western Learning. So you're going to come back to your Google Doc and the PDF of this particular document, go and evaluate this, create a summary, and then also source the document. I've provided some clues that will have you go back in the textbook and then also parts of this lecture to source the document. I would also suggest looking really closely at that last part, that last paragraph there in terms of Feng's purpose in why he is writing this particular piece. All right, go and pause the video and go and take a look at that right now. All right, guys. Hopefully, you're able to successfully evaluate this document. And perhaps, again, this was a difficult push to modernize. Again, they're talking about drastic changes that needed to be occurred, and then there would be always throughout this time period people who see this as a waste of resources. It's not about a new technologies. It's about being faithful to old ideas and so forth. Okay, all that is really, it's still hanging in the balance when it is all tested in 1894 in the Sino-Japanese War. So you have two powers that have been rapidly attempting to modernize their societies, and they go to war over the Korean Peninsula. And as a result, the Chinese are completely overwhelmed by their Japanese neighbor. And that signaled, in a lot of ways, a failure of the South strengthening movement. Now, there would be further pushes to try to modernize, but there's enough from the conservatives, particularly by the Emperor Dowager Cixi, to end the South strengthening movement. And not only that, but to nominally support a local movement of response against modernization. And this is a group called the Society of Harmonious Fists, which Westerners nicknamed the Boxers. In other words, an anti Western, anti modernization movement that existed to attack any Westerners, and something that the Qing imperial government just simply uh, nominally supported, kind of allowed it to occur. Enough so such that there were enough people killed, property destroyed, such that an international force of soldiers from Britain, from France, from Germany, United States, and even Japan would come into China to try to eliminate and to fight these boxers. And if anything, it's a cue of how badly things have gone for the Qing dynasty, how little control that they had, and any last attempts to try to create a constitutional government right at the turn of the century fails, and the Chinese Qing dynasty is overthrown by 1911, and there's the last emperor right there. But either way, we'll come back to that China in the 20th century at another time. But you can almost look at China as another success of a Western influence over a traditional empire. So what we want to end with is the last uh, two questions of today's activities. And that's one, to think about what we've discussed here. So, one, in an SEQ style response, so again, multi sentence response here, explain one economic reason for the collapse of Qing China. And the other is to explain one social change in China from 1750 to 1900. And again, anytime we have a discussion on change in continuity over time, you have to be able to talk about the initial condition, right? So, what is Qing China? How do we define some of the social aspects in 1750? And then go ahead and explain the changes that